Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Rosh Hashana Daf Yud Gimel is discussing the stage of plant growth that determines which year it belongs to. We're going to discuss grain. We're already in the middle of a discussion of grain. The Gemara has said that it's 1/3 growth. The Gemara wants to know the source for that. The Gemara is going to challenge the most recent source we've given and have some discussion on that. Then the Gemara will give another source that is a third. Then the Gemara will move on to some other plants, types of seeds, and seed-like produce that have a different determination. It's not 1/3. And this will take us into a sidestepping discussion of, you have a mixture of dry, powdery ingredients, and you take a scoopful of it. Can you assume you have all the ingredients of the mixture within your scoop? So let's begin our daf. The Gemara has seen, as we've said, that there's a Rosh Hashana for Meiser, there's Rosh Hashana for Shemitah. You need to know which year your plants belong to. Your produce is considered to be from which year. It makes a difference. What type of Meiser do you take? Can you take from one group of fruits on another group of fruits? They have to be from the same year. Is it Shemitah fruits or not? You got to know. So the Gemara says, well, the year changes from one year to the next on Rosh Hashanah. Question is, what stage of the produce growth determines which year it belongs to? Because it takes a while for it to grow. So the Gemara says grain goes by when it's 1/3 ripe. The grain's out there and it's 1/3 ripened. The moment in which it passes 1/3 ripened, whichever year you're in, that's the year you belong to, and that's where you'll get your halacha. So the Gemara says, where do we get this halacha of 1/3? So we've already said the halacha comes from the fact that when the Torah describes a sukkis after Shemitah, the 8th year, it called the sukkis of Shemitah. Why is it called sukkis of Shemitah? Because it has the grain that belongs to the Shemitah year, which is already ended, is now being gathered into the fields, and therefore you see that grain that belongs to Shemitah year is gathered on Sukkot. That grain must have reached 1/3 growth on Shemitah. That's where you when it's 1/3 grown before Rosh Hashanah, that's where it ends up being gathered on Sukkot itself. So Gemara says, now, how do you know that it's 1/3 growth? Maybe it didn't start growing at all. Maybe it grew a little bit. You see that there's Shemitah grain that's gathered later, that even after the year. We don't know what stage it had to be during Shemitah. Maybe it didn't grow at all. Maybe it's just called because it started, because it took root then. How do you know which moment is significant? So the Gemara says, no, so it has to be that it's 1/3 growth, and the reason is that you're actually, what you're doing here is you're harvesting it on a sukkah, not just gathering it, you're harvesting it. And we know that anything which is harvest time hits on sukkah must have hit 1/3 growth just before Rosh Hashanah. Now, where do you see that you're harvesting it? Someone says the Torah, in describing the yontif of sukkah, uses the word asif twice. It says v'chag asif b'tzeis Hashanah b'asbecha suas hasadeh. So why do you have to tell me twice that you're gathering at this time? So Gemara says one of the gatherings is not talking about gathering. One of the gathering means you're gathering off the plant. You're cutting it. You're harvesting. And that's where it says Chag ha'asif b'tzeis Hashana. The yontif in which you are doing harvesting, you're cutting off, b'tzeis Hashana, this refers to last year's plants. That's how we read the psukim. The Gemara says you're harvesting here something which refers to last year. So this is last year's plant you're harvesting now. Last year's plant being harvested now. That means that at Rosh Hashanah time, just before Rosh Hashanah time, it was 1/3 grown. The Rabbanan know that when it's 1/3 growth, 1/3 ripe, at Rosh Hashanah time, that's when you're going to harvest it on Sukkot, and that's what the Torah means to say here. So Gemara challenges this. The Gemara says, how did everyone know that it's 1/3? Were farmers? They knew that if it's exactly 1/3 at Rosh Hashanah, then it's going to be harvested. The Chachamim weren't farmers to be able to tell exactly that it's 1/3. Where did they come up with this number? Maybe it was 1/4. Maybe it was 3/8. Like, how do we know? So the Gemara says that this was a question that Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rav Zeir, and Rav Zeir said to him, don't mix into Chazal's measurements. You stay in halacha. Chazal knew what their measurements were. They made them very precise. They were based on what they knew, what they estimated, and therefore, and based on that, they gave a very precise measurement. The measurement has to be precise, otherwise it's useless. And he says, I'll give you a bunch of examples where Chazal had a certain estimation of a physical reality, and based on that, they came up with a measurement that they were very precise on. A mikveh has to be 40 saw, because that's what the minimum amount that a human can fit his body into and be covered by the water. And it's got to be 40 saw. We give a very specific amount. 40 saw missing one drop. He's no good for a mikveh. Right? Tumas oichlin, the tumah that's received by foods, is only if the food is the minimum size of an egg, because Chazal said that's how much a person can swallow. It can fit into the swallowing part of his mouth. Now, if it's one sesame seed less than an egg, no, it doesn't work. Now, Chazal knew that? Yeah, Chazal they decided on a precise measure based on that reality. The next one is that the minimum size cloth that's Mekabel Tumah is 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim. We had to come up with that. That's the minimum amount that a person will sit on. If it's one thread less, it's no good. And again, it's the same concept. Now you have this minimum amount based on an estimation of a reality. So that was Rav Zera's response to Rav Yirmiyah's challenge. Now Rav Yirmiyah then, he retracted his challenge, and he had his own reason that he said we cannot challenge Chazal's measure of 1/3 growth, but he gives a different reason now, and he says that Chazal did know that it was exactly 1/3 growth, and I'll show you where Chazal knew that. The Gemara is going to bring this down. It's a long discussion about Karban HaOmer, and in the end the Gemara will reject it. So the Gemara says there was a conversation between Rav Kahana and his Chaverim, and they asked him, Klal Yisrael came there to Yisrael for the first time, how did they bring a Karban Omer? The halacha is that the Karban Omer has to be brought from barley which ripened and was ready to be cut in the possession of a Jew. But the Eretz Yisrael, and also speak from Eretz Yisrael at the time was in possession of the Goyim who lived there before. So there was no barley that, it couldn't be that the barley was ripened already. I mean, what barley were they supposed to use? The barley that was ripened already, ripened in the possession of a non-Jew. The barley which is however level of ripeness it's meant to be, it ripened in the possession of a non-Jew. So you couldn't use that. And you couldn't use something which didn't take root at all, because then it wouldn't be Karban Omer for this year, it would be for next year's Omer. So what exactly did they use? The Gemara says, how did you know that they did bring a Karban Omer at all? Maybe the first year they didn't have any Karban Omer because of this problem. The Gemara says, no, they had to, because the Pasuk says that they started eating the produce of the land the day after Pesach. It means before that they weren't eating it because there was no Karban Omer, and on the day after Pesach they started. That means that they did bring a Karban Omer. So how'd they do it? So it says it must be that there's a middle stage, and the middle stage in which they knew that when they arrived, they saw that there were some fruits which is not yet at the stage of being ready to be picked, of being considered mature, which is this moment at which you determine which year you're part of. It's the same maturity level. Must have been someone's which didn't reach that, and then they reached it in the possession of the Jews once they came in and they took over the land. And that must have been 1/3, and they must have been able to tell exactly. So Gemara says, how do you know it's 1/3? Maybe it was long before. Maybe they came in and they saw that it was 1/8. Yeah, it was 1/4. It was 1/6. Maybe it's one of those. It was long before. How do you know that it was close and they were able to tell exactly? So Gemara says, no, it couldn't have been, because they only came into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of the month of Nisan. This is 5 days later. How much could it have ripened already in 5 days? It must have been really close. So they had to find the plant. They were able to tell that it was not 1/3 ripened, and then 5 days later, it was 1/3 ripened. That means that they had to have an exact evaluation as to how much it was. So Gemara says that's not necessarily true. Gemara rejects this. Gemara says because Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz Hatzvi, the land of the deer, and it's because it runs like deer, and it can ripen very quickly in spurts. And you have to say that that's the pshat, because otherwise in 5 days you also wouldn't be able to achieve ripeness from 1/3 to more than 1/3. There has to be that there was a spurt, and it went from being clearly unripe to being clearly ripe. If that's the case, then you don't have a proof from here that Chazal knew how to estimate exactly where it's holding in its growth process. Okay, now the Gemara has a different kasha on this source altogether, where we said that when the Torah says Chag HaOsef, Tzeis Hashana, it's talking about harvesting, not gathering. And harvesting means cutting the plants down. Gathering means bringing them in from the fields. The Gemara says, but asif here can't mean harvesting. It has to mean gathering. And the reason is because you don't have an extra phrase. We said that it means harvesting based on the fact that it says twice. It says chaka asif and ba'asbacha. So one of those ba'asbachas, one of those usage of the word asif is to teach me that the sukkah that we make has to have schach made from ba'asbacha migarcha umiyigvecha psailis garin v'yekev. You have to use the chaff, the leftover plants from the granaries. After you harvest, you take those plants and use them for schach. So that's why the Yontif is called Chag HaOsif. It's the holiday of schach. It's the holiday of using the remnants of the asifa, the gathering. So it's not an extra phrase. That's the name of the Yontif. You can't tell me that it's an extra phrase and therefore it's used and it must mean harvest and the entire lima that you made from that. The Gemara says you're right. So we're going to have to come up with another source. The Gemara says that this was a kasha Rav Chanina asked, and Rav Zera said, we used to have this one straight. Rav Chanina came, but he threw an axe into it, so now we don't have a good one. So the Gemara says we have another source. And again, we're looking for the source that 1/3 growth is the point of maturity, which determines which year a grain crop belongs to. The Gemara says this is from the pasuk that says, "V'asasas atfuah l'shleish hashanim." In the year before Shemitah, the grain will produce enough for 3 years. So the Gemara says you read it as follows: when will the grain be completed? L'shlish hashanim, at a third in the ripening process of the year. So you see that completion, maturity is established when it's 1/3 ripened. The Gemara says, how could you use that for that? You need this pasuk for what it's saying. It's not extra phraseology. You need it for what it's saying. It's telling you that you don't have to worry about what you're going to eat during a Shemitah year or the year after, because the 6th year will produce 3 times as much. It'll produce enough for the 6th, 7th, and 8th year. So this is not extra. Someone says, no, we see that from somewhere else. We see that from a different pasuk that says, then you'll plant and you'll have extra. So you'll have extra from what you plant and you'll have extra for years later. So therefore, this phrase is not needed, and it's therefore available for this drasha. Okay, now the Gemara brings in a brisa which discusses the time of maturity for other types of produce. When do they establish which year they belong to? So the Gemara talks about rice. It's a brisa that talks about rice, corn, poppy seeds, and sesame seeds. And the brisa says it goes by when they take root. Well before 1/3 ripe, it's when the plant is just taking root. So Gemara says, this is interesting. Where do you find such halacha that something is determined by when it takes root? We see all kinds of stages of growth which determine maturity and which year a plant belongs to, but taking root is not one of them. So Rabbah asked the kasha. Rabbah says, we see that a tree goes by when the fruits begin to appear. A grain and olives go by when it's 1/3 grown. Vegetables go by when you pick them off the tree. But this, where does taking root come from? And the brisa, it spells it the halacha. It says it determines whether it's part of a Shemitah year, or it's from after a Shemitah year, whether it's Meiser Sheni, or it's Meiser Ani, which year you could take Meiser on. Where do we get this from? So Gemara answers that these plants don't all ripen at once. And therefore, they don't ripen at once, and they're not picked at once. Therefore, there is no set time for an entire field that you could say, now they're all qualified as belonging to this year. Each one has its own time. The only thing that they all do together is they all take root. The whole field will take a root together. Therefore, Chazal decided to set it up by when it takes root. It was up to Chazal to determine. It's their opponent anyway. So they set it up by when it takes root. So Gemara says, why do you have to do that? Why don't you just let everything ripen at different times? What's the problem? Everything will ripen at a different time. When you have it all harvested and picked and it's in your storehouse, mix it all together, and then you have a huge mix of different things. Some of them will be from last year, some will be from this year. You're right. I mean, the problem was we didn't know which is going to belong to last year, which will belong to this year, because I harvest some, or some grow a third, or whatever determination you want to use. Some will be just before Rosh Hashana, some will be just after Rosh Hashana, and all be mixed together. I had to have a uniform determination for the entire field. It says Abaye asked the kasha, he says, let them be mixed. Let them be mixed. You'll have all in one lump, one big pile. Some will be from this year, some will be from last year. So what's the problem? I'll take Meiser, I'll take a shovel full of it, and I'll say this is Meiser and everything else. Yeah? So some of it is this year, and some of it is last year. But the rest of the granary is also some this year and some last year. So whatever's this year's fruit will be Meiser on this year's that's left, and whatever's next year's, the coming year's fruit will be Meiser on the coming year's fruit. What's the problem? So why can't you do that? And Abai says is that I'll even show you that you could do that. Because Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur says Rav Shimon Shazuri that somebody who plants pul hamitzri, Egyptian beans, and he wants to use them for their seeds, this is what he could do. He could pile it up, and he could have a big seedful, a huge grainful, and he could take a shovelful or a 1/10 of it and say, here is whatever's this year is Meiser on this year, whatever's next year is Meiser on next year. Well, no problem. Now we have to just mention here that Egyptian beans sometimes are eaten for their leaves, for their green parts, the pods, and sometimes they're eaten for their seeds. So here we're talking about they're eaten for the seeds, because if it's the pods, then it counts as a vegetable, and it goes by when you pick them. So we were talking about seeds, where it goes by when it takes root. So anyway, so the Gemara says you should be able to do that. So the Gemara says Rav Shimon Shazuri holds you could do that, but nobody else does. Rav Shimon Shazuri holds that if you take off part of it, you could assume that that part has an equal mixture to everything else. The Rabbanan don't hold that way. The Rabbanan hold that you assume it does not have an equal mixture to everything else. And therefore, you have to, maybe everything that you took off was all from this year. And then you can't, or maybe it was all from next year. You don't know what it is. And therefore, you can't use that to be meiser on all the things that are in the mixture. Okay, the Gemara says, so therefore you have a machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon Shazuri if whether or not you're allowed to do that. The Gemara says a psak in that. The Gemara says Shmuel said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur. You're allowed to do this activity with the grain. You're allowed to mix all the grain together. So Gemara says, but Shmuel doesn't hold that things are mixed. Shmuel holds like the Rabbanan. Shmuel said somewhere else, he said that the only time you could assume that a mixture contains all the elements in it, if you take off part of a mixture contains all the elements in it, is if it's liquid. If different types of wine mixed together, you take off some of the wine, you could assume that all the wine is mixed in there. But dry ingredients, you don't say that. So how can Shmuel here passing in that way? So Gemara says, no, not what Shmuel meant. Shmuel held that you're allowed to do what Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur said and put all the seeds together in one pile, not for the same reason. Not because you could take off a scoopful and assume it has both parts of the mixture, but because he holds that the maturity is determined by a different factor. It's not determined by when it takes fruit. He holds it's determined by when the fruit is fully grown. And therefore these we know are all part of a certain year because we could tell when they grew. And again, he's referring to the Egyptian bean here, the pul hamitzri, and that's why he says that you're allowed to pile them together. You don't need to worry about what's here and what's there. So, what have we learned today on the daf? We've learned about the time of maturity for two types of fruits. We've learned about grain. We know the grain is when it's 1/3 grown. The Gemara gave two potential sources. One is from the fact that the Torah refers to Sukkos as Chag HaOsif, which the Gemara first said has to mean Chag, which is the Gemara said means kutzer, it means harvesting, and it's telling you that it's Rosh Hashana, that it belongs to last year. The other source the Gemara said was from the passage that says V'asas Hatvua L'Shleish Hashanim, which we read to mean it'll become mature after it's 1/3 grown, M'Shleish Hashanim. The Gemara had challenged it. Do Chazal really know that it's what's exactly 1/3? The Gemara said either yes, they have to give an exact amount based on estimations, and the Gemara gave 3 examples of that. The mikvah, the tumah, and the tumah's eichlin and the tumah of cloth, tumah's medrus, and they all have exact amounts, even though they're estimations based on the mitzias. Then the Gemara said that Chazal do know exactly, like we see by the bringing of the carbon of Omer, the barley. They knew exactly that it went from that when they came in, it was less than 1/3 ripe, and now it is 1/3 ripe. Gemara rejected that. The Gemara said it could be that it was Eretz Tzvi, that it grew very quickly, but it was very visible when they came in. And then the Gemara went into the moment of maturity of various seed plants. The Gemara said it's when it takes root. The Gemara said it's different than other plants because they are all harvested differently. There's no other time that's uniform for an entire crop other than taking root. Gemara said, why do you need uniformity? Let it be mixed together, and then you can just take a scoopful, and it has all parts of the mixture as meiser from the rest of the granary. So Gemara said, that's a machlokes, so they're not allowed to do that. The Rabbanan say you can't do that. Shimon Shazuri says you can. We'll pass like the Rabbanan, you can't do that, and that's why it's not a solution. Shmuel pass like Shimon Shazuri, but not for his reason, not because he assumes it's mixed, but he says that it goes by one uniform moment, which is Gemar Pri, when it's fully.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.